So, good evening, everybody. You're all very welcome to another programme with us, Social Rights Ireland and the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum. This evening's speaker needs very little introduction for all of you who are, I'm sure, following geopolitical debates about imperialism, about Zionism, and about the future of international solidarity. Dr. Tim Anderson is with us this morning at 7 o'clock. Down under, and he is a renowned writer, a thinker, a courageous activist who isn't afraid to push back against comfortable assumptions, especially on the left. Tim's work takes on the blind spots of Western liberalism and explores why so many miss the significance of a rising multipolar world. And of course, the potential of all our movements, our anti-imperialist working class movements, that can often be dismissed or maligned in the mainstream discourse. So today or this morning, this evening in Ireland, Tim is going to help us unpack why Western left liberals so often oppose Iran, and what does that tell us actually about solidarity? What does it tell us about history and the possibilities for genuine global change? And tonight, as always, Tim is joined by our comrades Barry Murray and Tommy McKerney of the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum, and by our correspondent in Galway, Stephen Roach, who'll also be contributing. So thank you, Tim. Without further ado, I'm going to mute and hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Róisín. Welcome, everyone. It's a great honour to be with the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum and talking to comrades in Ireland. It's a great privilege for me, really. What we're talking about in relation to Iran really is the topic that I have been writing about, and something got published in Al Mayadeen today about it, is the tendency of much of the Western liberal left to jump onto these colour revolutions. Colour revolutions have been with us for some time, and they have certain features it's really a very clever tactic of imperialism, of Anglo-American imperialism, which co-opts and certainly gets the support of, or at least the silence from, much of the people who would otherwise be critical of imperial interventions and imperial wars. And I suppose Iran is one of the key examples of that today, but we've had many other examples of colour revolutions in the so-called Middle East, the West Asia, as I call it these days, particularly in Libya, in Syria. I recall one of the most dramatic experiences I had was when what I call the dirty wars on Libya and Syria were happening some 15 years ago. There was a big debate we had with other people who'd been in the anti-war movement here about the question of defending Libya, Gaddafi's Libya, and Assad's Syria at that time. And really, we were abandoned by most of the anti-war movement in this country because they saw some sort of colour revolution they could jump on, basically. And of course, the problem is there was a type of rationale going on their heads. I know that they didn't have any problems opposing the war on Iraq, which was an old-style conventional invasion, basically. Not because anyone loved Saddam Hussein. Indeed, Saddam Hussein was the least lovely of all of the Arab rulers who were under attack at that time. But on principle, nevertheless, when there was talk of rebels and rising up against a dictator and all of the other levels of propaganda that were aimed at Libya and Syria, for example, then things changed dramatically. I engaged in a sort of a debate back in 2011, 2012. We set up a group called Hands Off Syria, which was mainly involved with Syrian women, Arab women in Australia at that time, defending what they saw as a decent pluralist regime, basically in face of fanatical Al-Qaeda style groups who were employed by the US and NATO, basically, and their allies in the region, the Arab monarchies of the Persian Gulf, for example. And I gave up after a while because I thought in the end, as a writer, it was better for me to try and talk to honest and curious people who wanted to know about the political history of the Arab countries and what was going on at that time. Now we see very little has been learned because with the new colour revolution focused on Iran, we have the same sort of constellation of what we had considered to be internationalists or anti-war people in relation to Iran. So even though, for example, in earlier last month, particularly in the second week of January, we had officials of the Mossad and the CIA boasting about their support for the violent attacks, taking cover under what had been a type of peaceful protest against the trashing of the Iranian currency, which was something quite deliberately done in late December, basically, and the protests from the merchant class, people who were involved in financial dealings, was what came onto the streets for the first few days in late December, but was very quickly infiltrated by these agents of the enemy, basically of Mossad and of the CIA, who wanted a war of aggression or some sort of regime change in Iran. Came out, and there was the Iranian media, to its credit, and the Iranian media is probably the most important independent media in the so-called Middle East, showed lots and lots of video of what they were talking about. There was no shortage of evidence. I must say that it reminded me somewhat of the color revolution in Syria in 2011, where you had a similar type of insurrection in the case of Syria, led by the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a collaborator with first the British and then the US in the region for some time. But that led to the shooting of civilians and police at that time in I remember in the border town of Daraa. So it was very similar, but on a larger scale in Iran. And there was this, what they called in Iran, violent rioters. Really, they were armed terrorists with their handlers in Israel and in the CIA admitting openly in public that they were doing this, and they were walking alongside, whether they called them protesters or whatever, the insurrection that was going on in the second week of January last month, basically. So the cheer squad from the West was enormous. And so I wrote an article about this because it was interesting to me to see what were the type of ideological currents that jumped onto these color revolutions so easily and so rapidly and supported yet another intervention in the region. It's well known the motives now for the US trying to destroy independent states in the Arab and Muslim world. They want to give the open stage to their collaborators, their proxies, the Israelis and the Saudis and some of the other monarchies of the Persian Gulf, and control the entire region. And anything that doesn't that has a different stance, whether it's Gaddafi's Libya or Assad's Syria or Iran, which is the major supporter of the Palestinian resistance, which is the key reason for the constant aggression and hostility of the Israelis and the US to Iran. That's the reason for it. Iran has supported, since the revolution in 1979, the Palestinian resistance. The Palestinian resistance is the only reason why the Palestinian people survive to this day. Basically, had they not resisted, they would not exist as a people today. They would have been completely erased, basically. And then, of course, Iran has also supported what the imperial media calls its proxies. Actually, they're independent states that are given the means to help defend themselves, like the badly named Houthis in Yemen, which is really a revolutionary government led by Ansar Allah since 2014, recognized by no one except the Islamic Republic of Iran. Briefly, Syria recognized. Briefly, the Syria recognized Ansar Allah and had an ambassador from Ansar Allah in Damascus. So, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has been extremely important in supporting Palestine. They lost many, many young men defending Gaza, drawing the Israeli forces away from Gaza during that terrible genocide, the massacres in Gaza. And the independent groups set up in Iraq to help wrest control of occupied Iraq back from the US occupation, which is slowly being driven out of Iraq after 20 years, basically. So there's an important. I came to the conclusion when I was writing my second book on this region, on the Arab and Muslim region, that there was a single war going on in the region. It was a single war, not multiple wars. And that single war was trying to destroy any independent political will in the region. And Iran has always been absolutely central to that. And so the reason, if anyone had bothered to read what I was writing about it then, to support Iran was in the name of supporting the self-determination of a people. Not that you necessarily agree with the idea of a state that is founded in religion in some respect, but in the fact that that's what the people have decided for themselves. And a very decent people, I might add. Of course, the propaganda has been enormous, massive. It's been bought into by the Western liberals, or as I call them, left liberals, for a series of reasons. But anyway, I'll just leave it at that for now and see where the conversation takes us, perhaps.
Thanks very much, Tim. Thank you very much indeed for giving us even that little bit of background history. But we would share the same experience here in Ireland, that pushback. We're trying to discover the ideological background of those who are now out on the streets in Dublin, actually, supporting Iran with the new monarchist flag. It's quite shocking. And then the week after, we had Kurdish sympathisers for Rojava as well. And then when you look on mainstream, or when you look on social media, mainstream media, you see the juxtaposition of these flags, you know, the Israeli flag and the Kurdish flag, the Israeli flag and the new Iran flag, the Israeli flag and even the new Syria flag side by side. And still you wonder, the frustration is, why can't the pro-Palestine movement see this? You know, it's in front of their very eyes who the allies are. It couldn't be more clear. Sometimes I think that, you know, when time passes, people forget, or there's a lack of understanding or historical consciousness. And as a teacher, I would see that an awful lot. People, you know, don't have the historical context to try to analyze current material conditions. But this is also recent. I mean, we're not talking about colour revolutions decades and decades ago. Like you said, Syria in December 2024, now Iran in 2025. There was only 12 months between them. So it's very interesting what seems to be happening in Australia is happening here in Ireland. This is the liberal narrative that we must support the poor people of Iran and this kind of organic people's uprising. I'm going to go now to our panelist Barry Murray, maybe for some response even to Tim, or some commentary yourself, Barry. I know we've been talking about Iran for a few weeks now. Sometimes we feel like we're a stuck record, but there's always something new to glean.
Well, it's clear that Iran is the victim of yet another imperialist aggression. This is nothing new, of course, as Tim has just pointed out. We've had in recent times Syria, and then we have Venezuela, and then we have Gaza and Palestine in the middle of all of that. And I suppose, to put it in context, I mean, the American military has about 900 bases around the world, so they're perfectly, or they believe they're perfectly positioned, and I suppose militarily speaking they are perfectly positioned to sort of try and control the world. But in doing that, they can't ignore the fact that their downfall in ways is coming, economic and political downfall is on the way down, and that in itself is one of the reasons for this massive extension of appearance of wars all over the world. It has been named hyper-imperialism, and it takes all sorts of forms. It's not just about bombs and bullets, it's about sanctions, it's about threatening third parties, it's about cultivating Arab friends, it's about all sorts of things right throughout the length and breadth of the world. And of course, once again, at the expense of the global south, more than anything. And all of this hyper-imperialism ignores any international treaties, any laws that are supposed to keep some kind of world order. They don't matter anymore. And Iran, among others, is the victim of that. And the only thing that probably is acting as some kind of a deterrence to the Americans going all at it is the fact that Russia and China would appear to have stepped up to the mark somewhat. And it's not just as simple as they thought it might be. They also know that boots on the ground in Iran would be Vietnam Mark II multiplied by 1,000 maybe. So that's not really an option either. The other thing that bothers them, of course, is that the economic shift in the world has moved towards Asia and China in particular, and they want to do all in their power to destroy that if they can. The reality is that if they could manage to get Iran taken out of it, then they would have access, better, easier access, they think or believe, to China and Russia. China being, of course, the ultimate target. And they don't care what that entails. Clearly, they don't care what that entails. I mean, you only have to look at the amount of both financial and military support they give to the Zionists to bomb, a little piece of ground 8 or 10 mile wide and 22 mile long or something, containing a few million people. I mean, they just don't care. And they appear worse than that. It appears, as Tim pointed out, that the world has somehow or another fallen asleep and don't see these type of atrocities happening unless they're linked to somebody that they feel that they can support. I mean, they certainly can support Ukraine, but they can't support the Palestinians, and they can't support the Venezuelans, and the media can't support Iran either. Every piece of information about Iran on the television is prefixed by the fact that, or maybe a post note at the end, that thousands have been killed by the Iranian regime, with no context whatsoever. There's no talk of the fact that that all of this is both CIA and Mossad inspired. That's not mentioned at all. The other thing that annoys them too is the fact that in most of the global southern countries, there's a mood for sovereignty within those countries that has been building over the years. I know it periodically goes up and down. You have pink tides and all the rest of it, but even any of that, they see all that as a threat. The imperialism sees that as a threat, even the mildest deviation from their world order. And I don't think by any stretch of the imagination that we've seen the end of it by a long shot.
Thank you, Comrade Barry. Back to you, Tim, because I wonder if everyone has read today's article published by Tim, Why Do So Many Western Left Liberals Hate BRICS? I might ask you, Stephen, to share that in the link, if that's okay. Would you be able to? So it's entitled, Why Do Many Western Left Liberals Hate BRICS? So in that article, Tim, you're talking about the left's hostility to BRICS and that it comes actually from imperial habits of thought, Orientalism, saviour complexes, and then ahistorical Marxism that align them. And you also say unwittingly or unknowingly or knowingly, we often say here too, Tim. I think there's room to say that there are actually active agents, institutions that absolutely know what they're doing. And of course, mainstream media has a huge part to play in manufacturing the consent and also whipping up the sort of the frenzy for sympathies that are aligned with Western imperialism. If you could just speak maybe to us about today's article, particularly for those who haven't read it and hopefully will now that it's shared in the link. What prompted you to write in particular? I know you write often about, and you're very critical of the Trotskyists as well and Trotskyism. What would be your main take about why there's this strong rejection of BRICS, or inability at least to acknowledge the role of BRICS as a valid and legitimate alternative way of economic way of being?
Well, it's quite striking, I think, that we see the demonization of Russia, China, and Iran in particular, who are the most highly demonized and powerful protagonists within BRICS, rejected by much of the liberal left, basically. And my idea was to see what was the rationales behind that rejection. I mean, for example, we have regular rallies for Gaza in my city, in Sydney. It's a very popular cause, Palestine, but of course people come along for all sorts of reasons, which is fair enough. But the main organisers of the rallies in my city have been implacably anti-resistance. When I say anti-resistance, I mean against the Palestinian resistance factions themselves, against Iran, against Hezbollah, against Syria when there were an independent Syria existed. So it's a strange phenomenon, to have these people who are mainly the main organisers. For example, the people who organised the very big march across the Harbour Bridge in Sydney, which got some international attention. That they were Trotskyists or former Trotskyists who were and still control that group, who were implacably anti-resistance for different reasons. But really, I went back into something I had left for more than a decade into looking at their arguments, basically. But it seems to me that they share a lot with a lot of liberals who are seduced by the colour revolution ideas and who have a lot of let's say imperial Orientalism in their mental baggage when they come to anything. So they will talk about the Palestinian people as victims, as they talk about, for example, Indigenous people as victims in my country. But as soon as they lift a hand to resist, there's a completely different reaction. I imagine you have something similar in Ireland here, that basically there is sympathy for oppressed people as victims, but as soon as they lift a hand against what is in the back of the mind seen as the root of civilization or some sort of Western sensibility, then there's a very different reaction to it. So I was talking about the rationales behind that, which is not quite the same thing as the motivation for it, but the rationales behind it to do with a type of romantic Orientalism where there was this idea of the poor Palestinian people, the poor victims. And then there's a line of anarcho-Trotskyism, which has always been opposed to the organization of any independent people, basically more hostile, really, to the Soviet Union and its successors or any independent states. And some of the streams of that Trotskyism have been extreme against any sort of progressive state. And then you have what I'd call the ahistorical Marxists who really say that, look, the rise of China doesn't mean anything. That, the fall of centuries-long Anglo-American imperialism is not important. It's some sort of trivial thing because this is just global capitalism reshaping itself in some form. And China I heard an academic talking about this on a program I was on just a few weeks ago. The rise of China, the lifting of hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, doesn't mean anything. It's just a reintegration of global capital, as though global capital were some ahistorical matrix which didn't have any particular historical features. I've argued for some time that, for example, neoliberalism is not some political or label or recipe for, it's a particular historical process. It's an Anglo-American hegemonic neoliberalism, which has particular power features, basically, and we can't understand it without looking at the particular history of it. And of course, the rise of BRICS is very important in terms of the collapse of that Anglo-American hegemonic neoliberalism. And it's important because it opens some space for independent peoples, for little countries like Cuba, for example, struggling under terrible pressure there. It's not that, for example, as some people say, and I always think they're asking the wrong questions, Russia or China is going to save some little country. Why doesn't China save Palestine? No big country saves any other little country. That's not how it works, basically. There has to be a genuine Indigenous struggle going on. And then in those circumstances, we can look for support based on common interests, basically. So I think that amount is missed by some of the people some of the left liberals who are supporting these new imperial currents, new imperial currents which have very specific missions. For example, in the Pentagon, there are these two doctrines of this century, one called full spectrum dominance, you may have heard of, which is an idea articulated around the turn of the century, which says that US imperialism, the Pentagon, is organized on a basis to rule the globe, to be the dictator of the world, basically, not just in military terms, but economic terms, ideological terms, communication terms, all of the full spectrum of imperial activities. Then you have another one called destroying disconnectedness, which was articulated by one of their thinkers in 2004, which means that the Gaddafis of the world, someone who wants to stay outside AFRICOM, let's say an African country that wants to stay outside AFRICOM, is not connected to this imperial matrix, and so has to be destroyed, basically. And that's the hostility that, of course, the revolutionary states in the Sahel region are now facing too. But that was, they've spelt it out. They spelt out these doctrines, and people don't listen to them. It's like the media with Iran. They don't listen to the former head of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, or the Mossad sources in Israel who say, look, we are walking alongside you. We are providing the weapons to kill people in Iran now to bring about this regime change. Even though they admit it, there is still this ideology in Western culture, and of course, particularly in the imperial media, or as I call it, the colonial media, which repeats these things incessantly, basically, and enormously influential, basically, on the Western mind. So we in the left, I think, in the real left, have this mission to educate people. We're popular educators, and we have to understand these processes and look at the hopeful possibilities of organisation beyond fragmented forms. This is why the so-called axis of resistance was so important, or is still so important, despite the collapse of Syria, despite the huge catastrophe in occupied Palestine, to come together and form some regional links there. This is the mission that the late Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro had in Latin America, the mission from the 19th century, which was from Bolivar, from Martí, which said, look, little people can't resist the big powers alone. I think Martí had an expression, the trees have to form ranks so the giant with the 7-league boots doesn't walk between us. Little people have to come together and form organizations to resist. Otherwise, the old Spanish Empire or the new North American Empire is going to destroy us. And that's what's happening in the so-called Middle East there, that they will divide people. They'll use the Achilles heel of religion to divide people in the region. Sectarianism, they'll create and back these sectarian monsters like ISIS and Al-Qaeda to attack mainly Muslims, basically. There's this all mythology about these what they call fundamentalist or extremist organizations supposedly based on religion. They're not really based on the religion of the people in the Middle East. They're based on the needs of the imperial powers to divide and rule those regions. And so forming regional groups or global groups, and BRICS, of course, is the culmination of this, the possibilities of some important counterweight states. It doesn't matter that they're not your ideal of what you think the future is of a socialist country or your ideal of a state, but the fact they are important counterweights, which can provide some sort of relief. At the moment, for example, Cuba is being starved, and Mexico, Russia, and China are providing humanitarian relief to Cuba so that they aren't completely suffocated and starved to death, basically. It's very important. It's very real, the role of Russia and China and Iran, and to some extent South Africa and some other states in BRICS, to provide some relief for little people to carry on their struggles and to live an independent life, basically. That's why. And so why is it, I ask, that people that should have been our comrades are so hostile to Iran, to China, to Russia, and not seeing what most of the global South sees, basically? It wasn't the demonization of Russia for its attempt to push back NATO from its borders and protect the people of the Russian Donbass was not an obstacle to states in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, flocking to BRICS. All of Southeast Asia is in BRICS now. Important states in Latin America, important states in Africa are part of BRICS. They see the possibility of a different future. Not that Russia and China are going to save them, not that Iran is going to save them, but there's a different context in the world in which they can breathe, where the boot of imperialism is taken off their neck. And yet much of what I used to call the imperial left misses this. And so I think we have a role here to try and educate people, particularly young people, I suppose, who of course have flocked to the support of the Palestinian cause there, but they come across the organization in support of Palestine and they find people saying all sorts of things, two-state solutions and supporting the uprising of the Palestinian people is all very good, but condemning every other counterweight state that is potentially providing some sort of support to the Palestinian people.
I think what you're saying is relatable. It resonates here because you'd be quite surprised. You'd think that Ireland, one of the first countries colonized where colonialism manifested itself, British colonialism, you'd think that we would be a bit more advanced in our revolutionary understanding. And I do think we have a strong cohort of revolutionary thinking minds, activists, and organisations. But I imagine if you spoke to each one of them, and ourselves included, you'd see that you'd learn that, there's been quite a bit of pushback and censorship and hostility, or lack of support sometimes as well. So we're no strangers to that. And I know, Tim, neither are you personally, because just recently we ended an encampment, Break the Academic Chains of Zionism encampment at University College Dublin was kicked off by the local authorities, presided by the Gardaí. And you know that yourself, what it's like to be kicked out of a university. So it's quite frightening when you see, even within these institutions, these so-called institutions of elite knowledge production, it's quite frightening, the silence and also the censorship, even amongst academics who proclaim to be socialist scientists as well. What's your experience, Tim? I don't mean even personally, but the experience even of academia in Australia. Does that sound familiar to you? I know, again, you've had the personal experience of being kicked out, and we're seeing that now with doctors in Britain in particular, where there's these sort of high profile activists who are taking a stand and who are unashamedly and very coherently anti-Zionist, being targeted as well, and targeted with all sorts of slurs and accusations of anti-Semitism under the IHRA definition.
Yes, there's clearly been a campaign for many, many years, particularly in the English-speaking countries, because of course, Britain was the mother of the Israeli colony, and then it's been adopted by the North Americans to cancel any sort of anti-Zionist or pro-Palestinian voices there. I was in court yesterday in support of a young woman activist, Palestinian Australian, who was kicked out of her university and charged criminally with hate speech for criticizing some Zionists on campus, basically. And one of them was a former Israeli soldier, who'd been involved in massacres in Palestine. So people call this a Zionist lobby. I tend to think that because I'm one of the people that thinks that the Zionist tail doesn't wag the imperial dog, that the so-called Zionist lobby is really a part of the US deep state. Basically, it's part of the US deep state that supports the forward base effectively for US operations in the oil-rich Middle East region, basically. And strategically speaking, it's not just about oil, it's about strategic control, basically, because resource control comes from strategic control. And, there's no particular logic to simply seizing the oil of Iraq or the oil of Venezuela unless they also control the region. They want to control the region and control the access of others to the region. And that's why one of the key aims in the Middle East wars, the multiple wars, I call them wars of hegemonic decline, because as I think Barry was talking before, the economic decline of the US is linked to this proliferation of what we could call hybrid wars, which are sometimes invasions, but often is not these color revolutions and the use of proxy armies and propaganda and economic wars and so on. Put them all together, it's a hybrid war, which is really the dominant form of war this century, basically. And there's been an enormous explosion of it. And it is correlated to the economic decline of the US and the rise of East Asia and China in particular. Of course, the Anglo-Americans still dominate in the fields of propaganda in terms of finance and the dictatorship of the dollar, which is very important, or very alarming, damaging thing for little countries who can have their economies absolutely decimated by this dollar dictatorship. So the US-led imperial bloc has some strengths, although it's lost it in terms of technological leading and commerce and production. Production, technology, the leadership has moved to the east now. It's really the Asian century in terms of innovation in technology and production and commerce, basically. So that provides some relief to independent countries because they can have economic dealings with the big independent bloc now being formed in BRICS, basically. In terms of the global campaign, you would think it's almost counterintuitive to see that the Israeli faction of imperialism trying to restore its soft power when it's lost so much in terms of Gaza. I mean, the reputation of the Zionists is in the gutter now, really, around the world. We know most of the world hates the Israelis. Most of not just the global South, in the Western world, most of the people of the Western world hate the Israelis. Sometimes, if you look at the polls from the US Pew Company, for example, it's well over 70% in many Western countries. And the youth of the US have turned against the Israelis very, very strongly. But nevertheless, there's a renewal of this attempt to recover their soft power in some sort of way. And what they don't have in terms of the masses, they certainly have in terms of the institutions, the Western institutions. And really, academia is just another one of those. I was thinking at one stage, looking at the particular Israeli funding of my own former university. I was at the University of Sydney for 20 years and some other universities before that. And of course, there is a very strong link between Israeli funding groups and the university, but it goes much deeper than that because there are also Australian government and US government funding. There is strong official control of the university culture, which really makes it very difficult to step outside of that very censorial environment, particularly when there are conflicts going on. I was writing a lot about Syria prior to writing more about the Israelis and Palestine in about 7 or 8 years ago. And they didn't like that, but their hostility to anything about Palestine or Israel was much more powerful. And so they went for me for what I was saying about the Israelis and the Israeli massacres being carried out in Gaza 10 years ago in the 2014 massacres. Of course, this all didn't start in the last couple of years. So that extreme sensitivity to any very harsh criticism of the Israelis or any advocacy of the Palestinian cause that goes beyond us simply regarding the Palestinians as poor victims of some circumstance here is really, there's an extremely harsh reaction, and it's been taken on board by the administrators of most of the universities in this country. It's a sad fact now that really it's banned. Any mention of Gaza in an Australian university is effectively banned now. You cannot talk about it at all. That's they don't talk about it that way. They put some gloss over it to say that they are creating a safe environment for people and making sure that the feelings of poor innocent Jewish people aren't harmed and so on. But really, they have effectively banned any discussion of the great moral issue of our day. Really, as a person who grew up with the Vietnam War, I think it's absolutely essential that the students are talking about the great moral issues of the day. Why wouldn't they be? Why wouldn't they be in Irish universities talking about the Troubles during the Troubles? Why wouldn't the whole world be talking about Gaza in the last 2 years? It's part of a young person's growth, a moral, intellectual growth, to be engaging with these issues, I believe, and an important part of their higher education, basically standing up to these institutional figures who are there to be, not just the gatekeepers, but the censors and the executioners of independent voices. It's going on constantly. We saw it, of course, in the British Labour Party, the purge of the British Labour Party of any pro-Palestinian voices. That was an important campaign for the Israeli faction, basically. But I think it's particularly strong in the English-speaking countries because that's where they are worried. The Israeli faction of imperialism is worried that at some stage that their traditional sponsors will turn against them. That's why even if you don't think Jeremy Corbyn didn't agree with everything Jeremy Corbyn said, but they were petrified that someone who was openly pro-Palestine would come to lead possibly the British state, the British regime, which is still ideologically important in terms of Anglo-American imperialism, if not economically and politically as important as it was a century ago, basically. So they are obsessed with this, even though there's no force on earth that has done more to attract resentment and hostility to Jewish people as well as Israelis than the Israeli regime. There's no greater motor of anti-Jewish feeling than the Israeli regime, basically. People look with contempt at these criminals now, the criminals who are given impunity and are protected by every institution of I'm not talking about Ireland here now, I'm talking about Australia, I'm talking about the US, I'm talking about Britain, that sort of Anglo-American imperial diaspora, if you like, which is wedded at the hip with the Israeli colony, basically. And of course, it's true that if you look at imperialism or Anglo-American imperialism as a project, the Palestinian cause does threaten that project. It doesn't threaten the continental US or the continent or the island of Britain or Australia, but it threatens the imperial project of trying to dominate an entire region and keep out its potential competitors, because that's the way imperialism sees it. They want to keep out any other access of any other big powers, whether it's Iran or Russia or China, from the West Asian region, from the Arab and Muslim world. And of course, the reverse has happened now. You have a much greater presence of Iran, Russia, and China, and BRICS, really, because you see some interesting countervailing trends, such as BRICS recruiting US allies in the region, like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, who are doing terrible things themselves in their role as the ally to the US in this region. But nevertheless, BRICS, and led by Russia and China in particular, has been infiltrating the very collaborators of the US in the region, which is important from their point of view, and probably not well understood either by much of the liberal left that we've been talking about.
Thanks, Tim, covering a lot there. It would be absolutely remiss not to mention the E word tonight, Epstein. What do you think of the timing this week in particular, like when at the weekend, and I got in touch with you, Tim, I was thinking, God only knows what could happen in the next 48 hours, what we'll be talking about, Tim, when it comes to Iran, because there was talk of imminent threats to Iran, physically, invasion or threat.
Yeah, well, I know that it obsesses the North Americans more than most people, I suppose, but it's true that the source of the Epstein network as an agency of blackmailing important people and politicians on behalf of the Israelis has raised its head once again, particularly in US media. I think the US deep state, which is running these things and which we should understand, makes Trump much more of a continuity and a change in style rather than substance of US imperialism. The US deep state is able to think to some extent rationally when it comes to a war on Iran. We know that Trump's preferred tactics in his first term as well as his second term has been the use of mercenaries, of strikes, of so-called decapitation, in a sense, what he claims to have done with Venezuela, without a ground invasion, with apparently very limited damage to the US itself, is his ideal form of intervention, kidnapping a president and then claiming to control a country by remote control. I think there's still a great deal of uncertainty about the extent to which the US does control Venezuela. If you believed the Washington line, you'd think it was controlling all its finances now. If you believed what the acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, says, it's not as simple as that. Okay, there's reasons to question both sides here, but nevertheless, Trump's preference is certainly not to have body bags, not to have an invasion. Analysts have been saying, the ones that I listened to in the last week have been saying, that it's not a very good time for the US to try another attack on Iran, although they have mobilized a naval group around the Persian Gulf, although they lost many of their assets in the violence of last month within Iran itself. But Trump is very risk averse when it comes to having US casualties, and there seems to be a consensus amongst the people I listen to that they cannot carry out a regime change in Iran simply by missile strikes and bombing, basically. And they're very averse to having an invasion. They don't even have the capacity to invade. They don't have anything like the troops they use to invade Iraq, for example. And Iran is a much bigger country to Iraq. Nevertheless, there's been this constant pressure from the Israelis and from the Israeli leader Netanyahu, who has had a 30-year campaign to try and incite US attacks on Iran. The Israelis themselves are feeling vulnerable because they haven't recovered their missile defense that they had back in June last year in the so-called 12-day war. For example, those THAAD, the high altitude anti-missile defense, apparently they used about 100 in June, and the US only produces about a dozen a year, so they haven't recovered the air defenses that they had, and they were getting smashed in the last few days of the 12-day war. The Israelis were doing a lot of damage to Iran in the first few days, but in the last few days, the Israelis and their institutions were getting smashed by Iranian missiles. So they fear another even more devastating attack because the Iranians have thousands, probably tens of thousands of missiles, and many of them are capable of getting through those defenses there. So for all of those reasons, there seems to have been a withdrawal, at least a temporary withdrawal of what many of us assumed was going to be an attack, a second round of attack on Iran. We were thinking that from September last year and certainly also more recently. But that seems to have been deferred to some extent. It's still possible that that Trump might want to carry out some sort of symbolic attack, but the Iranians have signaled that if they do that, even a small attack, they will respond in a devastating way, in a way that they haven't responded before. And that will involve US bases in the region and, of course, another attack on the Israelis or retaliation against the Israelis, who are, of course, deeply involved in this. So they think the ground is set by convincing people that the Iranians are murdering men, women, and children in the streets, and so there will be some sort of fifth column that will come to their aid there, but they really haven't got a plausible alternative to replace the Iranian state, which is quite stable, has a lot of support. There are many people in Iran, for example, who, even if they aren't part of the Islamic Republic project, they are strategic supporters. Within Iran, they are strategic supporters of the Republic, of its foreign policy, and of much of its developmental strategy too. Remember, Iran has invested very heavily in education and training. It's developed a industrial base which is very strong. They've moved beyond simply being oil and gas exporters into a quite complex value-added economy. The upward path for women professionally has been facilitated in Iran. It's true that young women don't like a mandate of wearing a headscarf. They subverted that many years ago. It's not really enforced in a way that the Western propaganda says. But nevertheless, there's strong support from a number of different factions amongst the public for Iran, and that has increased in recent times. Interestingly, I have a Palestinian friend in Iran who has studied as a doctoral thesis the popular support for Iran's support for the resistance, for the Palestinian resistance. And it's increased at certain times. It increased recently, 6 years ago when Trump murdered Soleimani, the national hero of Iran, the main leader of the anti-ISIS campaigns across the region. In other words, people rallied behind the government after Soleimani was murdered. And after the 12-day war, there was another consolidation of popular support for the Iranian public. So there's actually very strong support for the Iranian government at the moment, even amongst people who don't necessarily agree with everything that they're doing. And of course, let's remember there is dissatisfaction in Iran at the current leadership, which is basically of the liberal or reformist faction, basically, as opposed to the so-called hardliner, or as they call it in Iran, the principalist faction. Now, the interesting thing there is that the hardliner or the principalist faction shares some features of Western conservatism, but it's different in the sense that its constituency is mainly working class people, because it's the principalists who have done most in terms of social security, in terms of direct subsidies for poor people, in terms of urban planning, in terms of the sort of things you associate with an interventionist leftist government is really the quality of the so-called principalists or hardliners in Iran, whereas the liberals, their constituency is mainly middle class. There are middle class Iranians, plenty of them in North Tehran, for example, who like the idea of a reconciliation with the West and greater economic opportunities. So there is an important class politics in Iran, but it's actually quite distinct from the Western or the Anglo-American pattern, basically. And so that liberal faction, nevertheless, has been, in terms of security, has been turned more and more towards getting ready for a direct confrontation with not just the Israelis, but with the US, because Iran has been preparing itself for at least a couple of decades to have a much broader war directly with the US and not just the Israelis there. So what the US has been doing and the Israelis have been doing in recent times has been consolidating the support base for a more unified resistant response by the state there. So in short, it's not really possible for the US to simply carry out some missile strikes and change the regime. They don't have a viable option on the ground. So in view of that, there is this hesitance. I don't think it's, and you'll see some people like the former British diplomat Alistair Crook, who is a very good analyst, by the way, if you want to talk to him, because as an insider, he understands how that system works. It doesn't mean that the threat of an attack is averted completely, but for the short term, the Israelis feeling vulnerable. Trump is not willing to and not able to put in an invasion force to carry out some sort of Iraq-style regime change operation. The situation remains very dangerous, but I think that there's a lull in the storm for the time being. Of course, the propaganda war will carry on. Of course, there's the good chance that armed attacks will be carried out because the US has conscripted pretty much all of the ethnic minorities who have some sort of succession current in them, including the Kurds, but not just, also the ISIS faction in Baluchistan and so on. So they will try and conscript all of the periphery, even the Shia Muslims in Azerbaijan, for example, in an operation against Iran. But nevertheless, for the time being, it seems like an all-out war has been stalled off for some time.
Thanks for that, Tim. And I'm conscious of time. So before we finish the recording, I'd like to go over to our comrade Tommy McCartney, lifelong revolutionary. So you're in good company tonight, Tim, with Barry and Tommy. Tommy, what's your analysis? There was a lot to take in, Tim. That's very comprehensive. But just even maybe in summary, Tommy, what would you have to say about Tim's overview of Iran?
I think that's an excellent presentation by Tim, and thanks a million for delivering that, Tim, because it's very enlightening, bringing us up to date with what's happening out there. And of course, we have to fit it into the global imperialism led by the United States of America and the weakening of the United States, particularly financially, economically, although it's still a powerful military power, but its global reach is being challenged economically, and of course as part of the aggression that is trying to wage at the moment. But yes, I think it's an excellent piece, and I think we have to maybe look possibly at the fact that we're talking here ultimately maybe about the class struggle, where we see, for example, the sympathy that is for the Palestinian cause and the hostility towards Zionism in so much of the Western world, and then the imperialist class have got to try and counteract as best they can the sympathy there is among so many people for Gaza by their propaganda campaigns and their lies. And of course, they have to use whatever they can to demonize Iran, which has proven to be the basis of support for Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. Really, the axis of resistance has been so powerful, but it's centered on Iran, which is, as you've pointed out, 90 million people. Chances of success of a ground invasion are limited, if at all possible. So it's a very difficult situation, but at least I think your analysis has given us hope. I think it's a very fine analysis, and thank you for doing so.
I must say it's a great pleasure to be able to talk to your group. Thank you, Róisín, for the invitation. I look forward to having more to do with your group. It's I know that many good things come out of Ireland, despite your sometimes pessimism about what's been going on there, but you're a much different version of it to the rest of the Western world, and there are some cracks in, I might say, the wider European scenario. Basically, there's been pressure on the government in Spain, some other parts of Europe. We've seen a withdrawal from Eurovision because of their hosting of the Israelis. So that pressure is very important, I think, in Europe at the moment. The European Union, of course, is a dead dog as far as I'm concerned, but nevertheless, there is still hope in Europe, particularly in Ireland. Some other parts where people have a history of fighting imperialism, and really those cracks in the empire are become very important for us, and they're very important in terms of us as popular educators, as I said before, because I think we all have a role in that as popular educators in terms of the campaign for the self-determination of peoples and the necessary anti-imperialism. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you to Dr. Tim Anderson, who joined us this morning at the very early hour of 7 o'clock, to Comrade Barry Murray and Comrade Tommy McKerney of the Peadar O'Donnell Socialist Republican Forum. Don't worry, Tim, we're very good at opening up the cracks here in Ireland, and yeah, you can be sure that we will rise again.